So, once again, greetings, Molweni. Gama langu Mthembukazi. My name is Mthembukazi. And most people call me by Kazi, and those who do know me, they call me Umam. Welcome once again to our climate agenda, defining our climate agenda, and today's World Earth Day webinar dialogue. It is an honor, and I truly appreciate having to be the facilitator under the Our Climate Agenda banner, more especially because this is an intentional platform we've created under Project 90 by 2030 to center intersectional, inclusive, and justice-oriented conversations and stories that deal with gender and climate. Project 90 is a social and environmental justice organization rooted in the belief that people and communities should be at the center of climate action. We work to shift mindsets and systems by advocating for low carbon development, um, climate leadership within young people, and amplifying voices where it matters, more especially in overlooked conversations centering around gender and around climate in decision-making spaces. So our work is deeply grounded in justice, not only environmental justice, but also economic, energy, social justice, but all of which intersect with gender. So through like this platform today with our climate agenda, we center the lived experiences and narratives of youth, women, the LGBTQIA plus communities, BIPOC communities, the elderly, disabled, and other marginalized communities, because we want to strive to move beyond a true transformative future where these voices are the shape or they shape the policy, they shape culture, they shape the narrative, but also they shape our future. So today, this is more than just commemoration. This is a moment of emergence where we hold space for accountability, where we allow dissent to take up space, but in a meaningful, respectful way. So, this is a collective effort. This is deeply rooted in Pan-African solidarity and the intersect of feminist visioning. And while these conversations are held under the banner of Project 90, I would also like to acknowledge the joint solidarity of other organizations within the space. We have Masimanyane's Women's Rights International, that is also based here in South Africa. We have the Coalition for Women, Human Rights Defenders in Tanzania, and the Southwestern Region Gender Network in Zimbabwe. Their continued presence across the region shapes the needed presence within the entire ecosystem of advocacy. And it reminds us that this work extends beyond borders. It extends so that this collective collaboration is visible, no matter how visible, but we can always stand together in solidarity. So each voice behind this camera, behind the scenes, we need to continue and contribute for daring to change, to inspire, to mobilize, and infiltrate these spaces so that we can amplify our own voices. We can be the drivers of change. We can be the actors of change as well. So reflecting on World Earth Day through a lens of justice, which is gendered, which is racial, intergenerational, and environmental, our climate agenda is deeply rooted in intersectionality, inclusivity, and I am deeply honored to be holding this space, to be with you as we allow the space for conversation, for depth, and anything in between. So I just want to take some time where we just bring ourselves towards ourselves, where we just say a short prayer, or we have a short moment where we just allow some silence so that we can truly commemorate the space. We can commemorate the day as well. So let's just do that together. And if you'd like, you can have a quick breathe in and an out. All right. Now that we have gathered in the space, we have brought ourselves towards ourselves. I just want to get into the context of today, which is understanding the crossroads or the intersect of gender and climate. So, as we step into this dialogue, I just want to set the tone and also reflect in the deeply interwoven nature of gender and climate, more especially in the context of who we are, where we are, and what we are trying to build toward. And we're living in a time where we are faced with injustices, and these injustices are faced by the voiceless, by the marginalized, not only because it is just visible to them, but these are injustices that are unbearable. So much so, there are so many things that are being forced to, so many people that are forced to navigate through the duality between what society deems or calls wrong and what their reality deems necessary. I'm talking about families setting up homes along railway lines just so that they can have shelter as we head into winter. Young girls having to experience menstrual poverty, not only having to carry the lack of resources, but the stigma and the shame that society puts on them. We have people using illegal electricity, not for an act of rebellion, but just so that they can get through the day, just so that they can keep their businesses afloat and their households afloat. We're talking about people waking up at 4 a.m., so much so just so that they can go to work, just because opportunity is so far from you, and having to have people use illegal dumping sites, not because again, it's a disregard of the environment, but because they don't have any other options to. These are some of the lived experiences and realities people face each and every day. So, when we speak about climate justice and gender justice, this is what we mean. We're not talking about abstract theories, we're talking about the now. We're talking about the urgency and the agency that is needed for these voices to be amplified. So, this conversation today, let it be a space where we not only reflect, but we reimagine and we hold the truth of these injustices and commit to transforming them together. So, framing these intersections, more especially when we try to find why these intersections between gender and climate not just overlap, they are actually a lived reality. It's the way systemic inequalities manifest during floods, during droughts, or food shortages. It's how care work, so often unpaid and carried by the women, the LGBTQIA plus communities, and marginalized communities, they quietly become the invisible scaffolding holding entire communities together where formal systems fail. And these crossroads, they become relevant when we dare to shift the perspectives. When we ask ourselves, why do I see myself in this? Where do I see myself in this? How does my community fit itself in this? And because advocacy can only inspire action when people find themselves in the narrative, this is where the danger lies. Because we create a culture of reaction instead of being able to be proactive. We wait for the crisis where we scramble for solutions instead of being able to have a culture being normalized where we are the agents and we have the urgency to act. So, I'm just going to pause right there so that we can welcome our panelists today. We have a Dr. Yvette Abrahams and Samantha Muller. If you can, guys, please just wave and say hi to the rest of the people joining us.
Hi, everyone.
Uh,
Thanks for having me.
Great. So today we have, as I mentioned, Dr. Yvette Abrams and Samantha Muller. Sam is a youth intersectional injustice activist based in Cape Town, and her activism is seen not only in her work as the operations coordinator and research assistant at African Climate Alliance, but also through her studies in gender justice and her contribution to the broader movement for deeper systemic change and justice for all. Sam has over the years been instrumental in movement building within the climate justice spaces through her co-creative efforts to build awareness and support action and advocacy efforts of young climate justice activists across the African continent. We also have Dr. Abrams, who is a respected scholar and activist deeply involved in shaping South Africa's just transition strategy. She is a feminist intellectual, activist, and farmer based in Cape Town. She holds a PhD, more especially being a former commissioner for gender equality and in South Africa. She has she has contributed extensively in national dialogues of sustainable development, energy democracy, and the just transition. Yvette currently serves as the advisor for Project 90 by 2030, focusing on climate resilience, inclusive development pathways across the African continent. Her work is deeply rooted in Afrocentric feminist approaches to sustainability, and she is passionate about Indigenous knowledge, intergenerational learnings, and building community resilience from the ground up. Welcome to the space. So, I'm just going to start with you, Sam. I just want us to go through some of the questions in terms of what does climate justice and gender justice mean to you, and how do they intersect?
Oh, so basically, um, you can't have climate justice without gender justice. I think that's one thing that like I always wanna always want to start with. Um, so basically, climate justice addresses the fact that have been, people who have historically been marginalized will experience the climate crisis differently. They will bear the brunt of the climate crisis. So climate justice basically aims to address the fact that climate change isn't just an environmental issue, but it is a social, it's a political, and an ethics issue. It has to do with human rights, equity, and social justice. So basically, addressing existing systems of inequality, yeah, basically addressing existing systems of inequalities that allows for people to disproportionately be affected by the climate crisis. Gender justice similarly addresses the patriarchal structures that, and this is the political, social, economic structures that create and perpetuates violence, discrimination, and oppression based on gender. And yeah, so basically, the way that the two of these systems interlink is that the oh goodness gracious, basically, so the way that climate and gender interlink is that people experience the climate crisis disproportionately also based on gender. Like Kazi said earlier, women and girls are often responsible for unpaid care work. So things like making sure that there's food, making sure that there's water, maintaining the house. Yet when there are ongoing droughts and water crises and water scarcity, um, women and girls have to travel far distances to go and collect water. They are then often exposed to heightened risk of physical violence. For example, with the droughts, I believe it was in 2022 in with the droughts in Kenya, women had to walk up to 2 hours.
And my sauce. Then I mix in my mushroom.
Had to walk for up to 2 hours to go and collect water, and there were numerous reports of a woman experiencing violence because of the fact that the routes that they took were also unsafe. Like there wasn't electricity, so there weren't lights. People couldn't see where they were going. But this was the reality of women every single day having to travel for up to 2 hours to go and collect water. Similarly, when it came to menstruation, when there isn't water for drinking, there isn't water for sanitation. So we see that the climate crisis not only creates new issues, but it also heightens existing issues where there isn't access to clean water in areas, and people have to travel far in order to make sure that they have the resources for, just everyday living.
Definitely, definitely. And hearing this from a fellow comrade that is also feeling about these issues the same, I can only imagine the type of work that we need to focus on. Yvette, your thoughts?
Um, I'm a historian by training, so I would argue that part of the drivers of the climate crisis, or to take it even further, part of the root cause for climate change is patriarchy. And in that sense, I would say that climate change is all about gender, that there's no aspect of climate change that is not about gender. And the reason why I say that is because historically, in order for climate change to happen, we had to develop ideas that, for one, that a certain kind of human is superior to another kind of human. And the very first way that that idea takes place in our history is through patriarchy. Patriarchy is 1,000 years old, so it's the oldest system of hierarchy that we have. And class systems began to develop only a couple of thousands years later and really took flight. Society really began to develop concomitantly with the climate crisis. In other words, the Industrial Revolution, the transition to capitalism, so we began with this notion that male humans are better than female humans. And that could in turn be exploited and turn into the notion that rich humans are better than poor humans, white humans are better than, and all other kinds of differentiations that we have. And so what I'm saying is that if we want to put an end to the climate crisis, we have to go back to those times when we respected the ecology. And part of that respect had to do because we respected ourselves, because we saw ourselves as part of, instead of, these very recent ideas in human history, the ideas that we're somehow above, we're somehow separate, we're somehow better than. Wangari Maathai puts it very well when she says, it's when we stopped thinking of trees as sacred that we began to allow ourselves to cut the trees. And so when you begin to walk back to those times when we thought of every other species as sacred, that brings us to pre-patriarchal times. My own language, 𝐒𝐚𝐜𝐢𝐥𝐢𝐭𝐚𝐭𝐭𝐭, for instance. Now, 𝐒𝐚𝐽𝐽 means people of people, but it's distinguished against animal people and plant people. So there are all kinds of people in this world. And our only differentiation is we are the human people, as opposed to other kinds of people. Now, you immediately see that involves a different kind of respect for everything in this ecology. And in the same way, many South African languages, for instance, only have one pronoun. They're only they, them. There's no his or her. And when you begin to study why that particular, 𝐒𝐚𝐽𝐽 is a little different, so I'm not going to go into that, or we'd be here all day. I'm not sure how deep you want me to go. But when you begin to examine why only one pronoun, it's because gender wasn't a thing in a pre-colonial society. Everybody was there. And people didn't think of gender as an identity. So today we think of gender as something that inheres to a person. The minute a baby is born, our first question is, what gender? But pre-colonially, that would have been a meaningless question, right? Because your only answer would be they, if you see what I mean. So it shows how
Exactly.
unimportant gender was to the working of our society. We thought of gender as a function. So you will get umama and utata. These are gendered roles. And part of that, again, was rooted in our beliefs around, ancestors and traditional healing. So the ancestor that's visiting you could be a male or a female ancestor. That has nothing to do with the conformation of your particular body. And so in a society where those beliefs are prevalent, where we believe in the people that came before us, the people that became after us, then gender really doesn't become a thing. You can't build a system of oppression around it. It's not important enough. And so literally it took 500 years of colonial indoctrination to bring us to this point today where, people at one and the same time can call themselves traditional, but they can also believe that men are superior to women. That is a historical process. It wasn't like that. And so with that historical process comes the other ideas that allow us to create climate change in the first place. I'll stop there. Maybe you can ask more questions and let me know quite how deep you want me to go.
Oh, no, definitely. You just touched on the root cause. And on that, the way that our indigenous systems are slowly creeping back into what is needed for that emergence so that we can honor Mother Earth, we can honor the planet, because we cannot separate ourselves from that. And I just want to touch into the next question where you, Yvette, can follow up and just speak on the impacts of what you've identified between climate and gender justice that aren't or that isn't getting enough recognition or that's not getting enough attention.
Well, maybe I should just start with my experiences. I started working with climate change in 2009, and at the time there were only 3 Black women working in this field. 3, period. It's deep history. There was myself, there was Brenda Martin, and of course Makomale Kalakala. Prominent figures, let me say, and some of the things that Makoma, for instance, was doing was creating, Women for Climate Justice, starting to create the grassroots movement that bring us now today, all of you, for which we're devoutly grateful. May I say, there's nothing makes me so happy as to see, young women take up this battle, not least because it's when young women, when young people generally start to take it over that we can actually see progress. So I guess in a way what I'm saying is at the time we were not a mass movement. And part of the things that we were saying was, look, if we want to have any kind of impact at all, the only way that's going to happen is if we are a mass movement. I was working as Commissioner for Gender Equality at the time, and I knew the only thing that's going to sway politicians is votes. And how do you get votes? By creating a mass movement. So it was quite difficult for us coming in at the time because climate change was such a male-dominated field. It's dominated sort of by hard sciences that were male-dominated to begin with. The water sector, the climate change sector, it was full of complicated terminology. There were all these barriers to entry. And of course, making it very difficult for us to do something like create a mass movement. Because if people don't understand what the problem is, then how are you going to enthuse them and allow them to understand that what is happening to them today, the drought, the flood, the pollution is part of climate change? Well, you've got to somehow find a way to explain climate change in a way that makes sense, even in their language. And the funny part was until we started, I say in the mid-2009s, 2010s, to think around how to make climate change a mass movement, nobody had thought, well, maybe we need to simplify it. Maybe we need to click in with what people see with the theory. And nobody thought, well, maybe we need to connect that theory to people's everyday lived reality. So I think what I'm trying to say, the first step towards gender justice was bringing it down to a level that made sense to people. And when, I was working in Limpopo, for instance, with Dora Lebelo from Gender CC, and we found that these women farmers knew exactly what was happening. They would tell us, yes, Sowing season is now postponed for a month because of the rains. We're having to harvest early because it gets hot too quickly. And now we have this problem when we want to dry the harvest, then it rains. And so we're having to shift around. They knew exactly what was happening. What they didn't have was this overarching concept of climate change. And that just shows you how the white male scientists were living in their own little bubble, thinking that moral persuasion was going to be enough to shift the needle. And so never seeing the need to actually explain it to the people to whom it was happening. So those are the big changes that we've seen. And those are the kind of things we need to continue working around if we truly want to be a mass-based movement.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Yvette. Sam, I'd like to pose the same question to you. What impacts between gender and climate do you feel are not getting enough attention? But just to touch a bit on what Yvette mentioned in terms of movement building, please.
So I was actually I was actually thinking about that quite a bit, about like mass movements and what they look like now, because now you can have a mass movement also existing like on social media as well as like a physical mass movement. So I was just, my brain was like running rampant now as Yvette was sharing. And I think that what what this what the system has done very well, even when it comes to advocating for justice, is that we are very fragmented at times, that like we're like, oh, this is a gender issue, but then there's so many other things that you're like, oh no, like somebody else will maybe address that. But something that I had specifically been focusing on is the experiences of the LGBTQI plus community in Africa, like across the African continent, and climate change. Because what we're also seeing, well, across the world, is basically the criminalization of queer bodies, right? And then it's also like state sanctioned discrimination. So now when you have like these climate disasters, and when you have these droughts, floods, and all of these things, they can actually turn people away. They can prevent people from getting humanitarian aid. They can stop people from getting access to healthcare. And it's like, sometimes it's like we want to address things under the banner of climate justice, but at times you just need to name it. You need to be like, the experiences of queer people is not the same as the experiences of straight people. The experiences of people of color is not the same as the experiences of white people. And then also taking it to specifically to countries where it's like, okay, another African country has now criminalized the LGBTQI plus community where they are, yet they are also disproportionately being affected by the climate crisis. So it's like, how do we also stay on top of like those types of policies, and what those types of and those laws, and what they also mean in our fight for climate justice. I think this another so just to throw in another point is also when we speak about child marriage, because the impacts of the climate crisis obviously just continues to perpetuate cycles of violence, including different forms of gender-based violence, from human trafficking to child marriage to this and this and this and this. And sometimes it's like people will be fighting for this, or fighting against this form of gender-based violence, and it will be like they are fighting in isolation, because it's also intentional that we don't see all of these groups fighting for the same thing that we are fighting for, because then it does keep us separate. So I think it's even like having conversations like this, and having and just introducing another element of how climate change impacts people is important. I very much help with movement building, because, for example, if I'm a gender justice activist and I learn that the climate crisis is a gender crisis, then I am more likely to also join in if I know how it relates to me and my lived realities. Yeah.
Powerful stuff, Yvette. I hope you're proud. And just before Is there any is there anything that you'd like to add on what Sam has just mentioned, more especially about the hardships and the fragmentation that is being experienced throughout? And then we can move on to the next question about the inclusive approaches as we are facing Freedom Month.
Kazi, you know that old climate change slogan, think globally, act locally.
That's the
Uh,
one.
Yeah, and I think what works for me, as I say, is my starting point is to think of a system that creates climate change and the kind of moral and ideological baggage that that system comes with. And then sort of have a look and say, okay, if it's the entire system, what string can I pull? What lever can I shift that will make the most difference? So the first question is about roots and causes, but the second question is about impact. And obviously, you know, I've come to the conclusion that almost 80–90% of what we have to do is local. And I'll use the queer example, for instance. In what I found in my work is that when you're a poor Black woman, heterosexuality is almost the only privilege that you have, almost. And so it becomes the only thing that you can leverage. Now, this is not to say that poor people are more homophobic than rich. Not at all, not at all. I mean, I've met incredibly homophobic. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is when you are trying to move people to activism, one of the things that you're going to look at is where do they draw their power? How do they see themselves as empowered? How do they see themselves as beings that are able to move society, you know? Black man has to forgive himself the crime of being oppressed in the country of his birth. And I'm talking about that personality shift. And so if you are in a township and you feel to work around queer, then that's great. That becomes the lever around which you then bring in other issues like, you know, why is the sewerage running down the middle of the street and how does that uphold our constitutional rights to human dignity? As you know, my utter passion is biogas. So I start with sewerage. That's my lever. But I guess what I'm saying is pick something, anything, figure out how it relates to the total overall picture and let your decision be based on what makes you strong. That's the act locally part of it.
Okay, thank you for that. Sam, I just want to add on that point that Yvette mentioned. How do we begin to disrupt it and have people claim their power? How do we disrupt power and how do we have people claim their power?
I think for me, I had to also like, I don't know, like re-understand or like, I don't know, question what my idea of power is or like how I understand power, because I think that like as a young person who also went to predominantly white Afrikaans schools, like I had an idea of what power is, and like I couldn't say anything about X, Y, and Z because I'm not the one in power, or like, you know, I'm not the one in power, I'm not the one in charge. I can't say anything. And then also, yeah, just with gender justice in South Africa, but as well, I think that with gender and climate justice, it at times gets very easy to feel like you are completely powerless because it's like there's so many structures, there's so many actors, there's so many resources that you don't have access to, that we don't have power, but we do. We've seen systems been like, we've seen people overthrow systems with less, and the amount of access that we have to more people, I would say, and yeah, like the different forms of the different ways that we organize and can get involved and can share information with people. I think that at that changing minds is also a form of of collective power. Like the fact that people could go from thinking one way to thinking a completely different way is also like very, very important. So also making sure, like Yvette also said earlier, where education and information is accessible in a language that I understand, it is changing the minds of a whole bunch of people who, yeah, it's basically changing the minds of a whole bunch of people. Similarly, when you have policies, people can influence policies, people can influence so many different things. I don't think you have to be specifically like a state actor in order to like be able to change things. And yes, with South Africa's history, we know we've seen time and time again that like you don't need to be sitting in parliament in order to be able to change things. Yeah.
Oh no,
Is that people power
never
through and through.
Exactly, exactly. It's collective power at its core. And it's something that we are strongly starting to adapt. And I think in light of this collective power and the hope and the faith that we need to lean on as we trudge forward, I then think in light of Earth Day, in light of Freedom Month, and this is me then coming into the next question, how can we then build inclusive approaches that are aiding to resilience, to mitigation, more especially to grassroots levels? Because we always succumb to top-down approaches. How can we then build inclusive approaches, more especially in this very significant month, on this significant day? I'll start with you, Sam.
I think that um I think that a big thing about like when it comes to resilience specifically is that we need to protect our right to exist, because it does feel like there's so many, like not just in our context but like across the world, um there's so many system, or there's so many governments and things like that that are reverting on people's right to exist. Like now it's like you cannot be an openly queer person, for example, or you do not have bodily autonomy. So basically the right to choose what like the right to choose what you want to do with your body. So I think that it's fighting for the right to exist, but also in relation to climate change and climate justice, it shouldn't just be that people, it's not just about people being able to survive, right? It's actually about people being able to be part of the transforming of the very systems that resulted in climate change. And I think that, again, it's about supporting grassroots, woman-led, queer-led, indigenous movements that are already doing the work and continue to do the work, and making sure that resources aren't just stuck in one place or don't always go to the same people, that especially when you're also part of an organization that then has access to resources, how do you then go and support other organizations? So I think it's also about ensuring that there is proper collaboration and networks
Mm.
of groups of people, of organizations, just coming together to fight for justice in general, whether we're coming from the climate space, whether we're focusing on gender, whether we're focusing on energy, water, spatial justice, but that there's always a space for us all to come together to fight for justice across the board.
Wow. Thank you, Sam. And that was a lot. That was, food for thought. And I just want to throw it to you, Yvette, in terms of how you can then find inclusive approaches to resilience, more especially in your advocacy work. And I think just to be a bit cheeky with the work that you're currently doing, which centers around the decolonization of the body, the work that you're doing of soap making, and the small business that you are currently embarking on. Please share with us.
Well, thank you, Kazi. That experience has been mixed. So I started off in 2012, and it came out of my climate activism because at the time people were kind of making the argument that development and and climate resilience were two opposing things. And no matter how many times we pointed out that theoretically that makes no sense. I mean, I think today it's clearer than ever that, in fact, it's quite the opposite, and that climate change is putting a stop to pretty much any kind of development. But at the time, it was a big issue. And I said, okay, I'm going to start a low carbon business just to prove to you that in actual fact, we can address climate change and create jobs and produce wealth at the same time. And didn't do so well on the producing wealth, but I will explain that in a minute. But you know, because I think when you talk to the people, one example has the power of 1,000 words. And so, you know, maybe I've been very cautious to say anything about the internet because I'm the pre-digital generation. Like, I was born when there was no digital. I was an adult before I saw myself. I'm going to leave that to you young people to make any kind of sense. But you know, I was well aware that we sometimes need to do things. And so this was an era we did all kinds of things. We started putting biogas digesters and solar panels in schools or preschools so that the community would see how this would work. And kept on doing that right into 2018, just showing people so that rather than coming and having a meeting and long conversations, we'd be like, here's how, as you know, P90 still does this. How do you build your own solar cooker? How do you build, you know, and I personally think that's very impactful because you have to show an alternative. It's not enough to say to people, don't do this. You know, people are like children. You have to be able to say, do that instead and show that it works. So I started this business making soap by hand. I experimented with lots of different renewable energy forms. And I have to say at this point, after 13 years of doing it, I'm actually doing it on a fire for the simple reason it produces sufficient wood in my rocket stove. So I've now empirically demonstrated that it can be completely zero carbon. I can't answer to what happens before it comes to at the farm gate and onwards, it's a zero carbon process. But one of the things I did wanting to make soap a mass market was that I priced it very low. So I've never actually tried to make a living off this business. I've always consulted on the side and put money into the business. And I'm very, very proud of that because natural soap, when I started, was somewhere around 100, 140 Rand. You know, it was an elitist thing. And when now down, my competitors are charging 55 Rand a bar of soap. And I'm like, great, you know. So that's why I say I'm not entirely sure that what I was doing was wealth creating, but it's now accessible to ordinary people. But what I found in the beginning, I would do a lot of advocacy. So, you know, with every customer, this is why you must buy a low carbon outside of, you know, the established green market. I would be trying to reach, and I would have this long spiel every time. Now, these days, I actually don't do any advocacy at all. I'm like, here's soap. It's good for you. It's going to prevent your eczema or your psoriasis or your whatever dark spots that you are having. And the customer says, great, and buys it. And, you know, it takes something to get a person from the township to spend 50 bucks on a bar of soap. So I guess that's what I'm wanting to say is my experience has been mixed. I started off doing this huge amount of advocacy, but actually at this point, I mainly just sell soap and save carbon. So sometimes you have to do things before you discover what works and what doesn't work.
No, definitely. But I think during that time, you've built a wealth of knowledge. And I think a lot of communities would thank you with the vast capacity that you've given to them, or especially the access to the type of information that you've made so casual. And yet this model you can't get in terms of advocacy or policy spaces that get to disseminate information to where it is needed. And I just want to touch again in terms of how that impact plays out in the communities. Please just continue with that point.
Firstly, obviously, it creates jobs. So I'm now at a point having, you know, proof of concept and demonstrated that it works and that it can put food on the table. I'm now at the point, you know, where I want to encourage women cooperatives to take this up, or for that matter, queer cooperatives, and you know, getting lesbians to get their nails dirty is a huge project, but well worth the effort. So my model is that I grow the herbs on this farm and then do various soaps or preparations, you know, because I wanted to show that this integrated zero carbon model can work. And like I said, I'm now at the point where it's replicable, and looking forward to, you know, creating the metadata, how many jobs can it create, how much carbon will it save, you know, how does it change our economy in terms of supply lines and so on. Now, I'm delighted to say that you know, it seems somewhere during the course of these 13 years that model was so successful that people have taken it over in other spheres. You know, if you want to look at during COVID with all these small community growing cooperatives that came about, it's only 4 years ago, but now it's standard in South African society that in every neighborhood there are a few gardens. Once you start to add up how much carbon that saves and how much carbon that stores through organic agriculture, then you begin to see that the replication can actually be quite powerful. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't stand in parliament and you know, with the president negotiate a just transition, but I think community gardens really shows you how a bottom-up movement can change everything. It can change everything. You know, up to retail where these cooperatives started coming to us and saying, why are you buying your spinach at StopRite? You'll walk right past my store, you know, to go support that conglomerate. And so, I think there are examples of how, for those of you who aren't very talkative or not big speakers, but still that there's lots of work that can be done that doesn't require anybody else's. And I think that's when I'm talking about look where you wield levers of power and use them. We needed something like COVID to make us start growing food, you know, as a popular movement. But now, of course, well, now we have the height of the climate crisis. So hopefully that will pressure us into initiatives like that.
Yes, definitely. But during that time, which was seemingly the advent of a lot of people losing their lives, carbon emissions went down. But I just want to rope you in, Sam, in terms of these inclusive approaches, how at African Climate Alliance, there was the Climate Week where these approaches spun for a week-long movement within communities, within different communities, speaking on different injustices that tie into climate justice as well.
So yes, with Climate Week, we basically focused on 6 different themes, and I think it was important for us to, one, partner with different organizations, partner with community-based organizations, different movement building organizations and partners, to show the different impacts of climate change on different topics. So we focused on energy, water, food, spatial justice, gender justice, and then there was a call for global solidarity, right? Because yes, there was a call for, the last one was a call for global solidarity. So we also then try to figure out what would be best for each day. So if we're talking about spatial justice, let's actually partner with community-based organizations to take us through the places and to take a train all the way back to town so that people could also see and experience how long it takes for people to travel from Langa to town every single day. And we were just doing this for one trip, and then having a conversation about spatial justice and how that links to opportunities, how that links to housing, how that links to land justice and all of these things. Also, like then going to the old Tafelberg site and having a conversation about social housing and how and the climate implications of housing in general in South Africa. It was then, yeah, I think the previous Cape Town Climate Week, we also went to the two of the community gardens in 𝐒𝐚𝐦𝐿 so it was Climate Week was important, or is important, because it was highlighting how these different topics link to climate justice, to overall climate justice, but also how within these very things, like when we speak about spatial justice, the focus was almost more on housing and transport, but that land was also there. On the day that we spoke about food justice, is that it's not just access to food, but it's also about how food justice isn't a top-down thing, like how we made provisions, like where I live as well, during the taxi strikes, like there wasn't food in the shops, there wasn't bread in the shops. So like it was basically that the community came together because we were like, cool, how do we make sure that there's bread for children to take to school? How do we make sure that there's fruit and vegetables? And like, just because we didn't know how long the strike was going to last. So it was like, how could we make sure that because the solutions basically exist with us. It is with us, and there are things within our reach. So we basically, yeah, my Oma was basically baking bread like the whole day to try and make sure that people had bread. And shame they tried to get me into the kitchen and it didn't work. But yeah, so I think it's also I think with these different approaches, it's also realizing that everything won't necessarily take the same approach, right? Where something else you may specifically be like, cool, we're going to sit together and we're going to comment on this policy. Another thing is, no, we need to be outside of parliament, and we need to disrupt the everyday movement, because we need more people to realize that this thing is an issue. And then something else may be, okay, let's create resources on the topics to show people, or like to begin to show people the links and make sure that it's accessible to people in their home language. But yeah, basically outside of Climate Week, I think, Kazi, the same thing was with March for System Change, where it was like, for the different demands that we took to Parliament, we ensured that the different organizations that also focused on the issue could lead in the demands that we put forward. Because while someone else may be like an expert in energy justice and another person's expert in water justice, like I could help with the demands for gender justice, but then it's also that we worked with organizations that specifically focus on gender justice. But I think that it's that there are many different ways to approach things and then to address these social and environmental issues. It's just also making sure, or it's just helping people navigate where we can, like how they would want to go about it, or which pathway and avenue they would want to take.
Definitely. Thank you so much for that, Sam. And I think it ties into your last point just there. And I just want to expand on that in terms of the approach that you have for advocacy as an activist. How would you say, through your work, the approaches that you've taken as an activist, that you can say that you've experienced, or that other activists have embarked on?
So I would start with the time that I was on campus, because I think that that's basically when I realized that activism does look different, and that there's not just one way to be an activist, or there's not just one way to go about advocating for any form of justice. Because I myself am not a big fan of public speaking. You will not necessarily see me in the front, but I absolutely love assisting with organizing in the background. And I think that was something that I had learned about, or had basically just gotten involved in on campus. And it was basically with in the residence that I was in. This was 2019, so also with the national shutdown for gender-based violence, like we did quite a lot of organizing within our residence alone, and then also in the broader campus, and then going to town. But I think I learned a lot. Yeah, I learned a lot from that time specifically because we had impromptu teach-ins where all the activists and things like that came to come and explain what it was like fighting for gender justice during apartheid, what it was like fighting for gender justice post-apartheid, and basically how, like, lessons learned and like, you know, just basically giving advice to young people as well in like the way that we mobilize and the way that we go about fighting for justice. And yeah, I think my activism has always been very community centered, and I think that because I couldn't understand going or trying to address these massive issues alone, because I also think that that's how people get burnt out a lot faster, or also that like you have that like what is it, like eco anxiety and all of these different anxieties because you're like there's so much that needs to change within these systems. Can I alone change it? And I think that knowing that you're part of a movement, like it's not just you. Yes, you play a pivotal role, but it is not just you, that there are other people going through the same anxieties and the same grief, like, and that together, that it's almost like that collective anxiety and grief actually fueled us just like continue to push and push and push and push. Because I think also that 2019 2020 thing was also like a very interesting time to also get involved in movements because of the abrupt COVID and like the abrupt stopping. So now you weren't even like physically together with people, but we basically just moved that physical movement online. And then it was like, you know, posting pictures with your posters and things like that and making posts, but still fighting for the same cause. But it was just it just looked different. But I think that a lot of my activism has been basically just doing things in the background. Like I love engaging with people and just basically seeing the different ways that we can, whether it's educational workshops and teach-ins, or whether it's marches, or whether it's rallies. Like there are so many different ways that people can get involved, like, or whether it's on social media and social media campaigns. But there are so many different, there's so many different pathways to fighting for climate justice, to fighting for gender justice, and all just social justice in general.
Lovely stuff. You've been at it. You've been at it. And I can only hope that with a young individual like yourself, Yvette, I would like to pose the same question to you. You're, as an academic, as an activist, your advocacy approach and what, tips and tricks you can teach us or give to us, passing the baton.
Well, sure, I hope that's a daily effort and not just on Earth Day, because, bringing up grandchildren in the struggle takes time. It's not something that's done overnight, but I hope I never lose an opportunity to say how incredibly proud I am of all of you and how much I look forward to retiring, because I see the movement is in safe hands, which is a feeling a revolutionary very seldom gets to have. So my advocacy, I kind of tripped in on a banana peel. So I started for entirely personal reasons. I started this Facebook platform, 10 Ways to Survive Genocide. And I did that simply because I am a genocide survivor. I'm not an expert on much else, but when the genocide in Gaza began, I thought, well, this is a piece of knowledge I can contribute, because demonstrably, my people know how to survive genocide. So what is there I can pass on? But through this work, as I was doing it now, suddenly, and like I say, I'm far from a Middle East expert, but I'm having to keep an eye on what's happening in the region. And I notice the sudden increase of extreme climate events. And I said, how is that working? And started looking at particularly heat island theory. We're always taught that one carbon emission is the same, no matter where on the planet it happens, that it's a global issue. And that's quite correct as far as it goes. But when you start looking at things like heat island theory and how local microclimates can be affected, then you speedily come to the conclusion that dropping 60,000 tons of bombs in an area the size of East London within the space of 6 months is not very climate smart. And most particularly if you do it in an area where there are jet streams. Now, you know, the jet streams are already part of the reasons for the extreme weather that we are having is because the oscillations of the jet streams have increased. Stop me when I get too technical. But when you start lobbing bombs right smack in an area of those jet streams in a very concentrated manner in a very short period of time, one of the things you do is you throw the oscillations completely out of whack. So that for me was a huge lesson. Firstly, it said to me, oh, Yvette, you started this out of solidarity, but now you discovered it actually affects you, because once you're talking jet streams, you're talking weather disruption planet-wide. Right? And so everything from wildfires in California to floods in Bangladesh, when you really start tracing the linkages, then you can definitely see that the war in the Middle East has worsened it in very, very unpredictable ways. And literally, you can call it an empirical experiment to show you why you shouldn't be doing that. But where it's led me is to then connect up with anti-war movements. And I'm glad that big global movements like Code Pink are now, you know, in the last two COPs, that the fact that war emissions are not measured, that they are not reportable, that they don't form part of international climate agreements has become a big issue. And that big organizations are now taking it up, that how are we regulating carbon emissions in every other sphere but war? And for me, that's going to be the question of the next 10 years, because for me, it brings in everybody, it brings in gender justice, as in the majority of people who die are women and children, but also that the people that are worst affected by these extreme weather events are also women and children and queers and so on. But I think most of all, it brings up the question of accountability. How is it that we, thank you, Farida, and certainly I'm looking forward to seeing your contributions. Over 30 years as a climate change movement, we've allowed ourselves to be bullied into not regulating military emissions. It makes no sense. We don't even know how much. And if we don't even know how much they are, how are we figuring out the scale of contribution to the problem? So it's kind of like we've been spending 30 years sleepwalking with everything that we've done, but we've allowed ourselves to be bullied into ignoring this really important part of climate activism. So two things, like I say, I guess the moral conclusion is when you act out of compassion and solidarity, then very often you will be blessed. I mean, that's my take on it. At least I'm now blessed in greater wisdom, and I'm seeing connections I never saw before. But I think the other part, to leave nobody behind, that a truly intersectional approach means that you have to have that global take, different groups of people, different geographical locations, while I might still be acting locally. I mean, this is an entirely Facebook campaign. I'm sitting here on my computer, but that I'm continually having to return to this notion of having a global grip.
Wow. Thank you so much to the both of you. And this really highlights the need and the call for global solidarity. I just want to pose this question to the broader group. If there's anyone that would like to speak, please pop it in the chat, or you can continue to ask Yvette or Sam on that point. And if you would like to speak up, you can just unmute yourself. Alternatively, you can also raise your hand if you would like to speak verbally. And this is a space for sharing. So if you don't have any questions and rather comments, please feel free. And just so that we can continue with the conversation around global solidarity and gender justice and climate justice, the intersection of those, any comments, any reflections, feel free. You can unmute your mic.
Hi, Yvette and Sam. Thank you so much for your very insightful input that you've given us. As I've indicated earlier, I am from a women's rights organization and 𝐒𝐚𝐦𝐚𝐧𝐭𝐚𝐭𝐴. We are in East London. But I know you are both from the Western Cape. So, and climate change issues may be, or I get a sense that it is more at the uppermost thinking in your part of the country. So my question is, and you so rightly said so, Yvette, earlier, you said our grannies and all the people have always known about this, they just didn't know this wonderful terminology that it was defined as. And from in the work we do, which is we work in urban areas, we work in peri-urban, we work in rural areas as. So you find that women are aware of all the changes that are happening and what they need to do. But I think we need to, and I'm happy to hear that in the Western Cape, you have a lot of young people getting involved in climate change activities and awareness. And I know Kazi is quite passionate about it. We were in a group at the Gender Links Summit. How do we encourage young people, especially where their main focus is putting food on the table at this point in time with all the high levels of poverty and unemployment we have? How do we get them to be a bit more vocal and effective around climate change issues, because it's going to affect them, not just us, but also to have them feel that they have some sort of a voice when it comes to things like these international meetings and the G20 summit, etc. They just see it on TV and see a couple of posters here and there. So I'm trying to understand, because as you both rightly said, there is definitely an intersectional part of gender and climate change. And with the work, what we're seeing and the unpaid labor, what women go through to put that food on the table because they're left behind with the children. And more as the older people are dying, younger women are stepping in to perpetuate what has been happening in the past. So how do we get them? And I don't want to go and do in-depth studies, or I just want them to get that little bit of, I can say, just get something or like a heat, if I'm using the right term here, but to sort of light a fire that gets them with that energy that I seem to be picking up when I'm talking to other young people. There must be something we are missing. I've not heard of, maybe Kazi, you will tell me later, but I've not heard of organizations on this side of the world, I'm just talking the province, that are all energetic around climate change, especially from the perspective of young people. There may be, and you may want to share some of them. We will reach out to them if they are actually, maybe some are on the call right now.
Sam, would you like to answer that one? And then Yvette, you can add on.
Thank you. So I think that, for example, the way that I got involved in the climate justice movement was because of the impacts that climate has on gender, and specifically gender-based violence. Because also when I as I was studying, I decided to focus specifically on the different aspects of gender-based violence, because it was also something that was directly impacting me. I think that for the most part, when it comes to like the responsibilities that a lot of young people do have, I think there's also at times a misunderstanding that young people are just out there being young people. Like for the most part, they are young people with a lot of responsibilities. Like they may be the breadwinner, they may be the first young person to go to study, whatever the situation is. I do think that people know, specifically as a young person, I know that young people know their experiences. They they sorry, they know what they are experiencing. So because people are not calling it climate change, and because people are not saying, oh, this is an issue of, this is a climate change issue, or this is an impact of climate change, doesn't mean that people don't know that, okay, come a specific month, it's going to flood. It's not just going to rain, it's going to completely flood, and it's going to impact my ability to go to school, it's going to impact my ability to go to work, and it's going to impact my access to clean water. I think that young people know. I think it's just specifically about how that one thing, or one of the things that's very important to you, is being impacted by the climate crisis. And then I also do think that if information and organizations, for example, aren't partnering maybe with organizations that are based where these impacts are happening, or where people are disproportionately experiencing the climate crisis, then like it is sometimes difficult for um like this to be, or like the climate justice movement to be something that people get involved in, because it could be that people are part of something where they're fighting for employment, like they're fighting for jobs, they're fighting against the increase in food prices, they're fighting against gender-based violence. So I think it's also, I don't want to say the responsibility of organizations, but in spaces where we have access to organizations, maybe specifically in an area that's doing the work, how do we make sure that people know that that is where they can go? Like that is one place that they can go, or that's one group of people that they can be in contact with. I think that sometimes information also just stays on top and it doesn't make it anywhere else. So that information may just, like, for example, stay in this call. But like, how do we ensure that outside of this, people have access to the information? And I think that sometimes for a lot of people, like also just because of positionality, climate change is like so far back because you're focusing on the issue that's staring you directly in the face right now, that it may be that like I will join the fight against climate change maybe down the line, but right now I need to make sure that there's food on the table. So right now I'm going to fight for the opportunity to get a job. Like I'm going to fight for the provision of jobs. I'm going to fight for the provision of fair food prices. Like I think that, yeah, a big thing is it's not necessarily that people are uninterested. They may be part of like the climate justice movement, but like from another avenue, or they may be part of another movement that is also somewhat part of the climate justice movement, or that the climate justice movement is actually part of that movement, but it just seems like people are not interested. But I'm saying that, yeah, young people are constantly fighting these different issues, but they're just we might just be addressing it from different avenues.
Thank you so much, Sam. Yvette?
Thank you, Farida, for that question. So like I say, for me, very much I've tried to pursue a strategy of addressing basic needs and allowing kind of the theory and the advocacy to come with that. So not to go too deep into it, but let's just say when you have a child with eczema, you've got a baby with eczema and it's crying all night, you as the woman are not getting any sleep and you have to get to work the next day, and it's causing problem with your childcare because they don't necessarily want the child to come if the child's just going to be scratching and screaming all day and so on. So for me to be able to say, look, the reason why your child has eczema is because of this consistent use of petrochemicals, which does very, very awful things to your skin. And one of the things it does is eczema. And particularly, the more melanin you have in your skin, the more sensitive you are to it. And this has to do with the nature of what skin is and how it reacts to petrochemicals. And often I don't even give that lecture. You know, somebody just comes and says, oh, it worked for my friend's baby. Give me one of those. Yes, here. You know, but so for me to answer that basic need, to give that woman slightly more time in her day or the ability to sleep through the night, for me that is liberatory, because that's where she will begin to gain space to maybe listen to a presentation about climate change. For one. And I think particularly with youth unemployment being 70%, that model that, look, we've got to stop hanging around for the social grant. We've got to stop hanging around for the coal magnates to give us, not saying that we are not justified or that we shouldn't have those things, but that maybe at some point we're going to have to realize that all that advocacy probably needs to go into how we produce. Do we produce in a way that addresses this issue of youth unemployment? How do we consume and here again, inspired by the pro-Palestine movement? Are we consuming in a way that lowers emissions and creates jobs? Or are we not? And I don't even think we've seriously begun to explore the power that we hold as consumers and as purchased to be able to create those kinds of developments. So yes, we must still go to Parliament and say, what the heck are you doing about youth unemployment? Because as you know, next elections, for the first time in our history, will be majority youth, right? Oh, it will now be people under the age of 35. So it really matters what we go to Parliament and ask Parliament to do. But the other part of it is maybe thinking around how do speak to that basic need that addresses the fact that in order to get to Parliament, you must have transport money, you must have food, you must not be sick. You know, how do we open up those gaps in people's lives? And I've always thought, you know, our strength is networks. Our strength is communities. I really love that example that Sam gave of the bakeries and the grandma started. And you know, like a fish doesn't notice water. In Africa, we probably don't notice this is our strength. But the minute you travel off this continent, you will realize that people are jealous of the Ubuntu. They are jealous of the community and the solidarity and the networks that we have. So I guess what I'm saying is work to your strengths. In your environment, there will be strengths. Work towards them and then figure out where you can intervene, but that you have sources of power that possibly you've never sat down and thought about. But when you start to think about it, you will see there are many, many things you can do.
All right, thank you, Yvette and Sam, and thank you so much, Florida, for that question. I believe you have your hand up again.
Thank you both for the input that you've given. And I want to also thank someone called Asha, who's from Island of Timber. Oh, I like that. I always put the purple heart when I'm happy. What I want, and I made the note, the reason I asked the question is because of the work we do. We actually also have introduced Young Women's Club to food gardens as a means of addressing, of course, food security, because we have high numbers of young people who are unemployed, and the stress is, how do you feed the children and how do you feed the community? So we are using that part. I was asking the question because we felt that as you rightly said, Yvette and Sam, you've got to introduce them among everything else that they're dealing with. You've got to gradually introduce them to this issue of climate change and what is happening. So we're at that point now, if I can put it this way, Kazi, I'm at that point where we want to introduce discussions around climate change and everything else and getting them all excited about issues. Because now the first thing was when we get into the community, the main thing is we're unemployed, we have hungry children. This child support grant that government thinks we are having a ball with barely buys bread. So when you address the one need, like you were saying, that you address one of their needs, and then you can introduce other topics and other things, areas of conversation. So I wanted to say, okay, maybe there are ways now to start to introduce these aspects to young women and to get them to then talk and look at some solutions that they could see. But then why I liked your comment earlier, Yvette, was because the wars are creating havoc, even with what we think we now understand are rains. I mean, we've had rain and rain and rain, which we cannot understand. And you don't know where it's coming from. And obviously, it's coming through other passages that's bringing it through to us as a country. South Africa never had this type of weather, ever. Everything was very predictable. And when it changed slightly, and we could adjust to that. But what's happening at the moment, you cannot predict. So it's important, as you say, to introduce these and see how it's actually assisting us knowing where these things are happening. So I think what I've taken from both of you is that when we're sitting down with young people now, we need to have, firstly, the immediate issues that are affecting them, work with those, because with us in working with GBV, that's an issue. And then start to slowly introduce some of the other aspects, because you cannot just bombard people, because they also have their other issues. There's mental health issues, there are a whole lot of issues, as well as social media. You know, what happens on social media, we don't realize how it affects them, but it does affect them adversely. So I think maybe I'll need to get Kazi to give me some role models in the climate change space.
Oh, there's definitely a list. There's definitely a list that I will most definitely share with you. And I just also want to add that I truly appreciate the insights that you are bringing to this space, Farida. It also allows us then to have homework after today. So I truly thank you. And I just also want to note that there has been another question that came in anonymously. And this is for our panelists. And it reads, following on this conversation of intersectionality, what are practical ways we can begin building this movement? Intersectionality, gender justice, climate justice are abstract to many. So what are ways we can begin to bridge the gap? I know you both have begun to speak on it, but some more insight would be lovely. So, Yvette, we can start with you.
Thank you. Well, I just want to pay tribute to the incredible work that we've already done. I mean, I can remember going to Women's Network Against Violence Against Women. It must have been around 2012 or so, and talking to them about climate change and using the argument that, you know, violence against the planet, just like I now said about violence against the planet, is part of the same patriarchy that oppresses us as women and as queers. And they didn't get it. I mean, this was overworked NGO people, and for them it was like, you're not going to bring another thing. You know, we're already overwhelmed. Don't bring another thing to our agenda. But look at us today, 2025, where I think the whole women's movement and the anti-gender-based violence movement truly gets it. So, you know, if you ever feel downhearted, then I think just look back on how far we've come. Yes, I know we still have incredibly far to go, but let's not forget the stuff that we are doing that is working. For me, that's the first point. The second one I can say, just from my personal point of view, is, like I say, I'm now at the point where I want to multiply. You know, if I want to take on the big carbon emitting giants like Unilever or Johnson & Johnson, that's not going to happen through one small soap business. There needs to be thousands and millions of soap businesses. So I will, in 2025, start to take trainees. I do offer soap making classes to NGOs. They get a special discounted rate. If you don't have money, then we can talk about, I'm willing to work with you on fundraising. I'm willing to work with you. Then we have other models of how to make these things happen. Like, obviously I have to eat, but, you know, for 13 years, I've never tried to make money off the soap. So I'm not about to start now. But I am opening up, and that is a one-stop service, meaning that I will walk with you through, you know, the bookkeeping, the marketing, because there's a lot more to running a co-op than just making the product. So that's what I'm starting. The other thing that I want to do is link people. And I'm not sure, I'm thinking of, for many years, I had this idea about something like a black-green directory. You know, do you want to buy your honey from a local beekeeper in your area? There needs to be a directory that you will find that person. The reason why I come up against it is, obviously, you know, if I buy beeswax, I then have to find the local beekeepers so that I'm not traveling to the other side of town to get my beeswax. You know, where do I get my coconut oil from? Olive oil, you know, obviously we're an olive oil producing region in the Western Cape, but it matters what farms I get that olive. Is it from a farmer that treats his workers well? Is it from a farmer that treats his workers? So something like a black-green directory is, you know, hopefully some NGO will take this idea and run with it, and then I won't have to do it. But just how can we begin to accomplish consumer networks where we know our purchase is strengthening a local food co-op, or strengthening a local small farmer, or a beekeeper, or somebody that is producing something? Because, like I said, at the end of the day, if we are not serious about addressing the 70% youth unemployment, we are going to have a social catastrophe, not a social justice revolution, but an implosion. You cannot take the final stages of climate change and high rates of youth unemployment like that and not expect it. So I think now is the place, now is the time when we can begin to move very large, you know, levers in government that haven't been willing to move up to now, but that we are reaching going to have to move. And the only direction that we can move in is to create local employment for local people.
Powerful, powerful stuff. And at this point, we are getting a call for systems change at this point. Sam, any inputs?
Oh, I think no, I think employment is a massive thing, because like Yvette also said earlier, the ongoing thing is still that if you are in the climate justice movement, you are somehow anti-development. If you are calling for a just transition, you are un-African, because you do not want the development of Africa, you want the development of the global north. So I think that for me, the biggest thing has been just linking climate change to like everyday things. So like, how does climate change impact my ability to have food on the table? How does climate change impact the ability to travel, whether it's to work, to school? How does climate change even impact education, right? Because it was not too long ago that schools were closed again because of the heavy rains, like that recent flooding and heavy rains, where it was like they advised parents to send their children to school with rain jackets because the roof had blown off. And it's like, how does climate change impact these everyday things? Because I think sometimes when we speak about it in this broad thing of like something I said earlier with like climate justice and gender justice, right? It's like, what does that mean to me every single day? Like, what does like no electricity infrastructure where I live mean for my safety? What does that mean for opportunities? So I think it's basically about reiterating how climate change and the system that created climate change impacts people every single day. And then again, also just making sure that where there are spaces that people are actively trying to fight for energy justice, for water justice, for different forms of justice, is that we know where these people are located. I like that directory quite a lot, because I'm like, it would be so great if I just knew, okay, I need spinach because I love spinach, that like I can go here because this is like like, you know, and not that like ethical, you know, that like some of these big shops like to say, and then you find out that they're actually treating the workers terribly, and that they're actually also just buying from other stores, um or hiking the prices. But basically, how I think it's just how things impact your everyday life, and then where people are doing the work to address these injustices, that we don't only form networks and connections with other people, but that we make sure that the people who come to like our events know that if you're interested in food justice, if you're interested in gender justice and energy justice, these are organizations where you are based, or who may know other organizations where you are based, that you could get involved. And yeah, like different ways that you can get involved. I think a big thing is also that there's a responsibility. Sorry, I keep on saying this, but there's almost like a responsibility when you have access to all of these networks, to make sure that we don't keep people because we're like, oh, you're part of ACA, you're only going to be here. So if P90 has an event, we're not going to share it with you. But that we make sure that people have access to everything possible, so that they can choose the avenue that they would like to go down, or organizations and movements that they would like to get involved in.
Would you look at that? Empowered people empower people. Thank you so much for answering that question so beautifully and touching on allowing the intersect of that question to just converge into something that is just wonderful. And it's even with the way that this dialogue went to just emerge with the different conversations and the narratives that came to be, it was very organic, and I appreciate both of you for just accepting that within the space. And just as we move on to our last question, speaking on a pivotal moment in your activism that you'd like to share to help build inspiration, and any last contributions to the space that you've missed out on or that you'd like to add on. Let's start with you, Sam.
I would have to go back to, I think, 2019. I think that was like a massive turning point for me, because I had also, and then, like I think I said earlier, began to understand that like activism doesn't look the same for everyone. So with the anti-GBV marches, as well as I attended my first climate strike. I think it was basically seeing people from all walks of life. So it was quite quite intergenerational. But that I also learned that there's so much that goes into leading up to that moment, right? Like the amount of effort and time that people put in, but also the sense of community that felt like it happened so quickly. I was a bit hesitant at times to go to marches, because I was like, I don't know anyone, and I feel like everybody knows everyone. But there was such a great sense of community, and I think that it is unfortunate is situation like those were the situations that brought us together, but it was also like it felt so necessary, because it was also that these are some of the people that I met at the time are the same people that have basically helped keep me going in activism as well, at times where I was like, yo, guys, I don't know how we're gonna, because then like I don't know how we're gonna continue to sustain this, or I don't know how how I can continue to, because it feels like I'm taking to the streets for the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. So I was just like, how yeah, it was basically that, just I don't know, I think like a pivotal moment for me was actually understanding that community also takes effort. Like, it's not just something that will happen and sustain if you are not also willing to actively give to it. And I think that, yeah, just a pivotal part for me was community. And that's also what I've been trying to take with me in spaces like ACA, but even outside of ACA, that making sure that when you also have this community, that the resources and things like that that people may need, if you know how to help people, because I think in community it's also about sharing resources and making sure that resources are available to people. Same thing with, like, if we decide we're going to have a march in town, making sure that, okay, then we'll find a way to get people to town safely. We will make it on a day that, like, you don't have to necessarily choose between work and this cause. We'll make sure that there are refreshments and all of these things, and that it's, yeah, I just think that, like, yeah, 2019 was a very pivotal part of my activism, because it was also how I learned that gender, like, properly learned how climate change was linked to gender-based violence. So it's almost like every time I go to a march, that's for one thing, just having something that makes sure that people know that, like, this other thing is also part of it.
Thank you so much, Sam. Over to you, Yvette.
Well, I'd actually like to acknowledge P90. Thank you very much. And because, you know, when I started out, 2012, 2013, this was such a carbon denominated, so like carbon emissions were so normative. Let me put it like that. So nobody could understand what I was doing. So I never got a cent in government funding from that day to this. Because at the time, for instance, if you applied for an agricultural subsidy, the first thing they told you is, well, you're going to have to get a mentor in order to be eligible for the subsidy. And guess who's paying this mentor? It's Monsanto. So I'm like, well, that's the very model of commercial farming I'm trying not to do, you know. And in the same way, you know, if you went to the small business people to look for help, then they'd all want a business plan. And I'd be like, listen, this is experimental. I'm trying to provide a proof of concept. I mean, I can give you a thumbsuck or a pure piece of poetry, but I can't actually give you a legit business plan. No, then you're not getting any money. Okay, fine. You know, and there were lots of other things. You know, they'd want you to take out a big loan to fund the. Well, I don't want to do that, because then I'm going to have to pay 18% interest, and I'm going to have to pass that 18% on to my customers. And really what I'm trying to do is lower the price of natural soap. So they were out there to help me. But what Lorna really did that was beautiful as director of Project 90 was she bought soap. And she made sure that Project 90 bought soap, like if there was a conference and there was gift bags. And it evolved into this thing where wherever there was a P90 workshop, I'd rock up with a suitcase and I'd be like, hey, buy soap, you know. So I ended up actually funding this business through sales. But part of the way I was enabled to do that was through Project 90. And I'm trying to explain, Lorna didn't have a budget for this. She wasn't raising funds for this, but I'm trying to show that even a small NGO and the difference it can make to one. Lorna, I will never forget you popping up on a Sunday and, you know, buying your monthly bar of soap, because to me it meant a world of difference as an entrepreneur. So I guess that brings me back to look at your own sources of power, because sometimes you don't even realize you have power. You don't even realize the difference you're making to somebody else's life. But really, it was through P90 that I got introduced to all these greenies that then became my market, because I could kind of piggyback. And it wasn't, oh, let's write a proposal and let's do advocacy and let's march to Parliament. It was just pure and simple solidarity. But that really, I really appreciate being able to acknowledge it to all of you, but also to hold that up as a sort of role model for how these things can work. We don't always need funding for everything we do. And I think that's a particularly apposite point to end, seeing as with the withdrawal of the United States from the climate investment funds, every single climate project is short 25%, right? They were the biggest emitters, so they were the ones that were going to pay in the most. But stuff like that doesn't bring me down. It doesn't slow me down. I'm like, great, the US empire is collapsing. Wonderful. I mean, that alone is making a difference to carbon emissions already. And then we are the opportunities and we are the solidarities. And the reason why I can think like that is because I've seen it happen in my own life. So just to end on that. Thanks, guys. Appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Yvette, for closing that so beautifully. And thank you to you as well, Sam. Um, I just I'm getting goosebumps from the how this conversation started and where it is now. It really allows us to really honor what comes with this day, honoring our people, honoring our planet, but also honoring our power, giving agency to our own power, making sure that we recognize it so that it doesn't get exploited on our behalf. So I just want to end off by saying apply a gender, disability, and social inclusion lens to your climate conversations because they are relevant, they are needed. And as we honor Earth today, let's also honor our interconnectedness. And I would love to say thank you for everyone for joining us. Please give a round of applause, some sort of reaction for our lovely panelists. And for everyone that was able to join us today, thank you so much wherever you are. Continue doing the powerful work that you're doing. Continue inspiring, mobilizing, and infiltrate those spaces. We are the agents of change. We are the change we are trying to see. We are the future. We are also making sure that we provide a future for the next generation where we can say we are not just succumbing to delayed gratification, but we were able to pass the baton through learning, through unlearning, and relearning. Diabulela and Ngosi, thank you so much and have a lovely Tuesday.